Have you ever walked off the field completely confused? Not angry, not frustrated with the umpire, not blaming the pitch or anything else, just confused. Because as you walked off, you kept replaying that dismissal in your mind and thinking, I was batting really well. The ball looked huge. I felt relaxed. You weren't just hanging in there and you weren't getting beaten every second ball. In fact, if someone had asked you 5 minutes earlier how you were feeling, you'd probably would have said, pretty good. And then one shot, one mistake, and your innings is over. If that's ever happened to you, I want to suggest something. Maybe you didn't get out because you stopped batting well. Maybe you got out because something much smaller changed. Something that most batsmen never even notice. Because here's what I discovered after years of doing exactly the same thing. Getting out when you're batting well is completely different to getting out when you're struggling. When you're struggling, it's easier to understand. You're late on your shots, you're nervous, you're chasing the ball. Nothing feels comfortable. But getting out when you're in, well, that's different. That's the dismissal that stays with you. That's the drive home where you keep asking yourself, what happened? I know that feeling because I lived it for years. I'd get to 20, sometimes 30, occasionally 40. People would tell me I was, batting beautifully. I'd hear things from the boundary like, big 100 coming today, Damien. And for a little while, I started believing it. Then 20 minutes later, I'd be walking back to the sheds. The strange thing was I didn't feel like I'd forgotten how to bat. I hadn't suddenly lost my technique. I wasn't thinking, 20 different thoughts. It almost felt like someone had switched something without me even noticing. For a long time, I couldn't explain it. I thought maybe I needed better concentration. Maybe I needed to be, mentally tougher. Maybe I simply wasn't disciplined enough. But none of those explanations really fitted. Because if I could concentrate well enough to make 30, why couldn't I concentrate well enough to make 100? That question stayed with me for a long time. Eventually, I realised I'd been asking the wrong question. The real question wasn't, why do I lose concentration? The real question was, what changes after I get set? Because something does change. It's not your technique, it's not your ability, but your relationship with the innings. Think back to when you arrive at the crease. Everything is pretty straightforward. Watch the ball, move your feet, play what's in front of you. Your whole world is about surviving the next delivery. There's nothing really interesting about that. You aren't trying to make 100 at that point. You aren't trying to, impress anyone. You're simply batting. Then something, happens. You settle in. The nerves settle down. You find your rhythm. You start timing the ball. The scoreboard starts ticking over. And without even realising it, your attention starts drifting. Not a lot, but just enough. Instead of being completely absorbed, in this ball, a tiny part of your mind starts wandering into the future. You notice you're on 28. You realise, 50 isn't that far away. Someone on the boundary yells out, keep going, Damien. You begin thinking about batting through drinks. You start imagining what this innings could become. But here's the problem. Your body is still standing at the crease, but part of your mind has already left. Now, that's a dangerous place to bat from because cricket is always played in the present, never in the next over, never at 50, and never at 100. Always this ball. I often think that's why batting can be so cruel. The game doesn't care how well you've batted for the last 40 minutes. It only asks one question. Can you deal with this ball? Every delivery is a fresh examination of that. The batsmen who make big scores aren't people who somehow stop thinking. They're people who keep returning their attention to where the game actually is. One ball, one decision, one moment, again and again and again. One of the biggest misconceptions in cricket is that making 100 requires extraordinary concentration. I don't think that's true. I think it requires ordinary concentration repeated extraordinarily well. Now, that's a very, different idea. You're not trying to become more focused than anyone else. You're simply refusing to leave the present moment. Now, when I finally understood that, something changed. I stopped chasing innings. I stopped, chasing those milestones. I stopped trying to protect scores. Instead, I became curious about one thing. Can I win this ball? then the next one, and then the one after that. Now, some days the answer was yes, and some days, yeah, it wasn't. But the process stayed the same. And that's what, The Century Within, my book, is really about. People often assume it's a book about, making centuries. It's not. It's a book about understanding what happens inside your mind while you're trying to make a century. Because the difference between 25 and, 100 usually isn't one magical shot. It's hundreds of tiny moments where you choose to come back to the present instead of drifting to the future. So if you're someone who regularly gets starts but struggles to go on, I'd encourage you to notice something in your next innings. The moment you feel comfortable, ask yourself, where is my attention right now? Is it on this ball? Or has it quietly, wandered somewhere else? That single question might tell you more about your batting than any technical tip ever could. Because maybe you've never had a concentration problem. Maybe you've simply been leaving the present, a little earlier than you realise. And the beautiful thing is, if that's the problem, it's also the solution. You don't need to become a different batsman. You don't need a new technique. You simply need to come back to the present, to this ball. And that's where every great innings is really built. Not all at once, it's one ball at a time. So if this resonated with you, I'd encourage you to watch this next video here. It's why you overthink at the crease, because it takes, today's conversation one step further and explains how to stop overthinking. So until next time, bye for now.